Hey buddy. A couple weeks of researching Bigfoot got me to realize that the 1950s and 60s were really a crazy time for the cryptozoology world. Anything supernatural. And I assume that had to do with the Roswell incident in 1947, making flying saucers and little green men popular. But a full year before that, a town in California reported seeing a red bird monster rocketing around town. It's sort of hard to compare Mothman to Bigfoot. There are a lot of parallels, but there's also quite a few contrasts. The Bigfoot phenomenon is really a compilation of thousands of eyewitness accounts from across the globe over thousands of years, with only one really lucky piece of video evidence. Mothman, unfortunately, is really much more of a localized event. It seems to have started in a place called Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The Patterson-Gimlin film is a solid piece of evidence that only has 2 eyewitnesses to corroborate its existence. Mothman has no physical evidence whatsoever. However, hundreds of witnesses came forward reporting seeing a large bird man. But it seems that Point Pleasant, West Virginia wasn't exactly the sleepiest town. Home to an abandoned military ammunitions facility nicknamed the TNT plant, West Virginia was actually home to hundreds of UFO and alien sightings. In fact, only a few months before the Mothman incident, there was an infamous alien encounter from a being calling himself Indrid Cold, flying a cigar-shaped spacecraft, who landed in the middle of the road, flagged down traffic, and with a permanent smile on his face, telepathically communicated to a driver. And that incident was verified by several people on the road that day, and was actually blasting on the radio while Mothman was flying over Point Pleasant. And this was a crazy time in the United States. It was the Cold War, and this is also the time of MK Ultra, Project Blue Book, weird propaganda constantly blasting the airwaves. This was actually a very confusing time to live. So it makes you wonder if all that Mothman stuff was just in these people's heads. The West Virginian Mothman is considered today to be an example of mass hysteria, but is it possible that these people were actually seeing something? Sure, I can believe that there were a few people who got scared when they saw an owl and blew it out of proportion in their minds. But could hundreds of people be wrong about what they saw? And like a year ago, I never would have thought twice about something like Mothman. And I probably would have just dismissed all of that at the face of it, except for the fact that the United States Air Force, specifically the now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, home of Project Blue Book, a regular hub for UFO activity, was only about a 2 hours drive from Point Pleasant. And also there were apparently men in black regularly harassing the locals. Not just people who witnessed the event, but even reporters who were writing articles on it. In fact, even researcher John Keel received several strange phone calls warning him to stop looking into Mothman. Strange premonitions and prophecies. The Mothman was followed up by a bridge collapse, killing dozens of people. And there's a Native American curse, apparently, from fallen Chief Cornstalk, whose grave was actually found in the area where Mothman was most commonly seen. And of course, there were even cattle mutilations. Were these people seeing something? But before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to my patrons for all of your support. I couldn't do this without you. If you like what I do and you'd like to support the Armored Skeptic, please consider donating to my Patreon. Also, check out my merch store. I'll have fun new designs out every month. And of course, the best way to support my channel, guys, please like, comment, and subscribe. On November 12, 1966, in Clendenin, West Virginia, a group of gravediggers reported seeing what they described as a man with wings gliding through the trees above them. 3 days later, on November 15th, 2 18-year-old married couples were out on a nighttime joyride by the old TNT plant in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Roger and Linda Scarberry were in the front seat of their '57 Chevy, with Steve and Mary Millette sitting in the back back. While pulling out of the woods, the 4 young adults described seeing a man with wings standing in front of the plant. As they approached, the car's headlights hit the figure and reflected back at them 2 large red eyes. The figure awkwardly hobbled around the corner to hide. Roger turned the car down Route 66, and as they drove over the hill, it was standing up next to a billboard, staring at them, waiting. Panicking, Roger slams on the gas, and before they knew it, the creature was swooping over the car. The figure chased them down the road for quite a while, even after the car reached over 100 miles per hour. They said that they could hear the creature's wings hitting the top of the car, and could see the large red eyes leering at them through the back window. As they approached town, the figure eventually seemed to lose interest in them and disappeared. The teens eventually decided to drive back out to investigate the creature a second time. As they approached the same stretch, they noticed a dead dog. Just then, the red-eye figure darted across the road. He followed them again before losing interest. Distraught, pale, and exhausted after their harrowing night, Roger and Linda Scarberry, out of risk of sounding crazy, decided to call the sheriff's office late that night to report the incident. And upon investigating, apparently, they found scratch marks on the roof of the car. The next day, their story ended up getting published in a late edition of the Point Pleasant newspaper, which created a bit of a local craze. The night after the reported sighting, hundreds of people, many armed, had flooded into the old TNT plant area to investigate this bird monster. Around the same time, about 11 o'clock at night, Marcella Bennett and her 2-year-old daughter Tina decided to drive out to her sister's house. Her brother drove them out in his car along with his wife. The route would take them past the old TNT plant. They arrived at her sister's place and found that her children were home alone. She and her husband apparently were at church for the night. Marcella Bennett stayed for only a few minutes to talk to her nieces and nephew, and then decided to return home. As she was walking to get into the car, her brother stopped on the stairs and said, "Hey, look at the lights in the sky." Marcella Bennett dismissed this claim, saying she didn't want to see any lights. And just as she was unlocking the car door, she noticed a tall figure out of the corner of her eye. It was staring at her from over the parked car. She saw its man-like legs first, then scanned her eyes up to see him standing over her, with his head turned sideways. She tried to run, paralyzed with fear. She fell straight onto the ground, on top of her 2-year-old daughter. When she could finally get on her feet, she grabbed her daughter and ran into the house, covered in blood. The family barricaded themselves inside, but the creature persisted, stalking the house and peering in the windows for several minutes. The group called the police to rescue them, who took 20 minutes to arrive to the home. But when they got there, the creature was already gone. Maybe the police would not have taken a report like this seriously. Maybe they wouldn't have taken the report from the teens seriously. But in both incidents, it seemed clear to the police that the parties involved were genuinely terrified. Normally with supernatural stories like this, the witnesses like to brag about how special they were to be in that moment. But what seems to separate the Mothman from most of these stories is that most of the witnesses were in fact humiliated. Over a period of the next 13 months, hundreds of people would come forward reporting to have seen a man-like bird in the Point Pleasant area. The last time it was reported to have been seen standing over the Ohio River on the Silver Bridge. Only a few weeks later, tragedy would strike the town of Point Pleasant. On December 15, 1967, on the coldest day of the year, Silver Bridge suddenly collapsed into the river, killing 46 people, and the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, stopped talking about Mothman that day. A comment in my Bigfoot video said we should reject silly ideas like Bigfoot on the face of them. If an idea is ridiculous, it's not worth our time. That's not how skepticism works. You can't know that you can reject an idea until it has been explored. In fact, when somebody makes a claim, it's our duty as skeptics to test those claims. J. Allen Heinrich, who worked for Project Blue Book, once said, "Ridicule is not part of the scientific method, and
and people should not be taught that it is. The steady flow of reports, often made in concert by reliable observers, raises questions of scientific obligation and responsibility.
Project Blue Book was the face of the US government's UFO research branch, tasked with determining if UFOs represent an advancement in technology or a threat to US security. When respectable, reliable people make bold claims, it's our duty as a skeptic to investigate those claims with sincerity. Insulting someone for their experience does not make that experience any less real to them. Imagine it happened to you. One day, a 6-foot-tall winged birdman stands in front of you and flies away. Who are you gonna tell? Who would believe you? Maybe this was mass hysteria. Maybe people were letting themselves get caught up in the excitement of it. The creature, though scary, seemed harmless enough. Nobody really got hurt. On some level, I actually want things like this to be true. And it's my strong desire to make these things true that drives me to be such a harsh skeptic of them. Because if it can survive even my ego, then it must be true. The researcher most famous for the Mothman story is arguably John Keel. John Keel was already researching bizarre activity in that area, following a string of cryptid and UFO sightings between Michigan, Ohio, and West Virginia. Mothman seems to be tied in with the UFO phenomenon somehow. Not only was Mothman referred to as a UFO because it is a flying bird man, but apparently it was also seen in tandem with lights in the sky. Point Pleasant was a fairly Christian town. West Virginia is just skirting the outside of the Bible Belt. There wasn't a lot of social incentive to come out and say that you saw something that looked sort of like a demon. And that's what's really interesting about the descriptions of the creature. They're each just different enough that you know they're not just copying each other, but they're all similar enough to know that they're all experiencing the same thing. Roger and Linda Scarberry drew the creature looking somewhat like an owl in an aggressive position. However, said that it was over 7 feet tall, and its wingspan was over 10 feet wide. Marcella Bennett described it as being 6 foot tall, a bird, but not a bird, like a man with wings. Very few people describe anything resembling arms, and though everybody seemed to say it had man-like legs, almost nobody describes any kind of foot. It's sort of difficult to pin down an exact description for the head. Apparently, it would quite often tuck its head into its shoulders, but it had 2 large red eyes that would glow when they hit light. The body was fuzzy and the wings had large feathers. Only a couple people seemed to describe any kind of tail, which is the weirdest detail because what bird can fly without a tail? It was described as being light gray or white, and it looked, quote, kind of like an angel would look. The men in black came to town, okay? Not only were these weird G-men coming into town with black suits and black hats and black Cadillacs, they harassed many locals over the Mothman and the UFO activity, including a reporter. Mary Beyer was obsessed with finding answers, and she was accosted multiple times by the men in black. Sometimes at her office, and once at her home. Connie Carpenter, an 18-year-old student, was driving home from school and saw Mothman standing on the side of the road. He flew straight up into the air and disappeared. And after reporting this incident, she too was accosted multiple times by the men in black, one time ripping her shirt and handing her a note that said, "Be careful, girl, I can get you yet." The flying is the creepiest part. It is not only an extremely efficient flyer, being able to fly, of course, up to 100 miles an hour. Several people say that it can take off straight up. One person even described it as being like a helicopter. That's a weird way to put it. But despite its aeronautic proficiency, it was an extremely awkward runner. That and the fact that it turns its head sideways when it looks at you, it's starting to sound like some nightmare fuel. I mean, what was this, like a government psyop or something? Did the CIA put LSD in the water supply? Did Wright-Patterson Air Force Base open up like some sort of portal or set some kind of beacon that was accidentally welcoming all sorts of UFOs and aliens and creatures to Point Pleasant? Were the lights in the skies projectors and they were beaming down holograms of fake birdmen to scare people? Was the Mothman an alien? The police called a biologist to see what this creature could possibly be. Over the phone, the police described it as being a 6-foot bird with red eyes, and the biologist immediately said, "This must be a sandhill crane, a migratory bird extremely rare to West Virginia. The sandhill crane is only 3.5 feet tall, but its wingspan is 6 feet." The newspaper published an article saying that this sandhill crane is out there. It's rare and protected. It's 5.5 feet tall, which is a lie. And most importantly, the police said they will arrest anybody in the TNT area caught with a weapon past dark. Nobody in town is allowed to shoot this bird. The entire TNT area got blocked off. The public was restricted access during certain times of the day. Apparently, the TNT plant and the surrounding wilderness were the final resting place to Chief Cornstalk. Legend has it, after he died at the end of a great battle, he cursed the Americans, and that curse resulted in the birth of Mothman, who manifested on that land apparently after the United States military converted it into a munitions plant. About 20 years after it was decommissioned, they discovered that the land was horrendously polluted and contaminated. Not only did it have red water below the surface, they found arsenic, lead, and a litany of other toxic materials. Of course, the United States military denied that there was contamination there until they could deny it no more. And maybe that's what all of this was about, was keeping secret the fact that the land was contaminated. And maybe the Mothman was a mutated owl that had grown oversized. The TNT plant area is now a wildlife reserve. Since it was declared such, apparently all supernatural activity basically stopped in the area. So was it a curse? Explaining something like Bigfoot or aliens is sort of easy for us because we have things within our logical paradigm to explain them both. Bigfoot is like a mirror of our past, a devolved giant version of us. Aliens are like a tiny futuristic version of us. Explaining Mothman is a lot harder because it forces you to accept realities that don't fit any of our current paradigms. As far as we know, there is not a single animal alive 7 feet tall that can achieve flight, let alone fly at over 100 miles an hour. So we have to accept that maybe it's a genetic experiment, an alien, a monster, an interdimensional being, a fallen angel. At the time of the earliest Mothman sightings, the news was being blasted with stories of Indrid Cold, the alien that was flagging down traffic and became friends with a motorist that night. The police and the military were taking those claims seriously at that time. So I think that we probably should too. And there have been multiple other Birdman, Mothman, Batman stories reported throughout the United States since then. The last few years, he's been seen multiple times in Chicago, most notably at the O'Hare Airport. The Chicago Mothman would end up having to be its own video though, because even though that sounds similar, the descriptions are just different enough that this is probably a separate creature. People say that the wings are more membranous, like a bat, and that it runs on all fours like a gorilla. Wait. Can't the vampire bat run? What does the vampire bat run look like? No! Okay, that's enough creepy shit for me today. That's gonna have to be a different video. Tell me what you guys think. Have any of you seen the Mothman? Have you seen anything similar? I'll see you in part 2 when I debunk the Mothman, and afterwards I'm going to do a follow-up vlog on my second channel. The links will be in the description.